Elliot Stone was never good at waiting. It wasn't something he liked to admit, but he had a deep-seated aversion to idle moments, especially the kind that allowed his mind to wander. That's why, standing in line at a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday morning, he was already fidgeting before he even reached the counter. The world outside was gray and uninspiring, and the line inside the cafe felt like it was moving at a pace slower than his thoughts. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He didn't need another pointless reminder from his calendar. "Extra shot of oat milk in that, thanks," a man in front of him said, turning to the barista with a pretentious air. "You know, I really prefer organic oat milk. The texture is just more consistent than regular oat milk, don't you think?" Elliot blinked. He couldn't help but overhear the conversation as the man went on, dissecting the intricacies of oat milk like it was the most important subject in the world. Elliot wasn't even sure why the guy was still talking. He had ordered his drink and now seemed determined to educate the entire line about the benefits of choosing plant-based over dairy. To Elliot, it was a perfect storm of irritation. First, he was late for work, as usual. Second, the barista had been giving way too much attention to the guy in front of him, allowing the line to crawl forward at a snail's pace. Third, he hated oat milk. So much. It tasted like chalky disappointment. His foot tapped the floor. Then, with a jolt of something electric, something unexplainable, everything froze. For a split second, Elliot thought it was just his imagination. His eyes darted around, searching for the cause of the strange sensation he felt deep in his chest. It wasn't a glitch or a hallucination. No, this was real. The barista was still holding the steaming cup mid-air, her lips slightly parted, eyes wide. The man in front of him, the one going on about oat milk, was frozen in mid-sentence, his mouth wide open in mid-lecture. Every person in the room, the rain against the window, the clink of silverware, had stopped. Time itself had simply stopped. Elliot stood motionless, his heart racing. He blinked again. The moment stretched into what felt like an eternity. "Holy shit," he muttered under his breath. He reached out, gingerly brushing a finger across the edge of the counter. It was solid. The coffee cups, the napkins, the few half-filled mugs on the table, all motionless. Not a sound. Not a ripple in the air. It was like someone had pressed pause on the universe. That he felt a rush of panic mixed with something else, something thrilling, something almost intoxicating. Elliot Stone had always been a man who hated wasting time. And now, it seemed, he had all the time in the world. Without thinking, he moved. He walked to the front of the counter, passing by the frozen barista. He couldn't resist the urge to reach out and tap her shoulder, just to see if she would react. She didn't. Her posture was stiff, a statue suspended in time. He smiled, laughing nervously under his breath. This was absurd. This was impossible. But it was real. Elliot looked at the row of drinks that had been lined up, waiting for someone to claim them. He felt an odd sense of entitlement rush through him. The man who'd been talking about oat milk was still standing there with his cup, frozen mid-sentence. It seemed ridiculous, but Elliot walked over, took the man's cup from the counter, and sipped it. Disappointment. Oat milk. Elliot spat it out. Ugh. He tossed the cup into the trash and wiped his mouth. The sensation of having all the power, all the time, was intoxicating. It felt like being a god. He could do whatever he wanted. He could walk into traffic, avoid any awkward conversation, even steal the tip jar without anyone noticing. No one could stop him. He was outside the normal flow of things. He could steal every last coffee bean from this place and no one would know. After a few more minutes of exploring, taking a step on the barista's counter, tossing a few sugar packets in the air, and laughing as they drifted like confetti, Elliot felt a sudden tightness in his chest, as though something was pulling on him from the inside. A sharp pang, just beneath his ribcage. He froze, looking at his own reflection in the window. The man staring back at him was, well, him. But something was different. His face seemed older. Was his hairline further back? Had those lines near his eyes always been there? No, no way. He was imagining it. Time had only stopped for a few minutes, right? His fingers brushed his temples. The pain in his chest flared again, but it was subtle. He'd never felt this way before. As if, somehow, time itself had reached into his body and started to shift the gears. Okay, Elliot muttered to himself, okay, that's enough. He took a deep breath, willing himself to start time again. And, just like that, everything resumed. The barista blinked rapidly, as though waking up from a dream. The man in front of him continued his monologue about oat milk as though no time had passed at all. Elliot felt a little dizzy. Something wasn't right. He stood still for a moment, trying to shake the feeling. The pain in his chest subsided, but the sense of wrongness remained. At the counter, the barista handed him his coffee. He tried to take it casually, but his hand felt stiff. He tried to smile at her, but the expression felt forced. What the hell just happened? He left the shop, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Could he really? His phone buzzed. A message from his boss. Elliot, where the hell are you? You're late again. Your project is due today. Get here ASAP. Elliot didn't even bother to respond. He just started walking faster, the rain splashing at his feet. But something else nagged at him. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He felt it, something in his body was wrong. He felt more tired, more run down, despite only being in his late 20s. He thought about the man in the coffee shop, the one who was still going on about oat milk. Elliot had only stopped time for what seemed like a minute, but it felt like an eternity. Was it possible that time was doing something to him? Something that wasn't visible. Elliot took a deep breath and kept walking. He would figure this out. He had to. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole day felt different now, his thoughts were clouded, and his body felt like it was on the verge of something inevitable. The sharp pang in his chest from earlier hadn't gone away completely. In fact, it was getting worse. His steps were slower, like he was walking through molasses. He hadn't even made it halfway to work when he had to stop and catch his breath. All right, get it together, Elliot, he muttered, wiping the rain from his forehead. It's just a little fatigue. Nothing to panic about. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just fatigue. Something was happening to him. Something he couldn't explain. He arrived at the office, feeling like an old man who had just climbed a mountain. His boss, Greg, was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrow. Look at you. Barely made it in time, Greg said, his tone as sharp as always. Elliot forced a smile. Sorry, man. Traffic was a nightmare. Yeah, Greg muttered, already walking back to his desk. Anyway, you've got a presentation in 15 minutes. You know the drill. Got it. Elliot slung his backpack over his shoulder, his fingers cold as they brushed the strap. He could feel the weight of the minutes piling up inside him. Every step he took felt heavier, more deliberate, like he was aging right before his own eyes. He just couldn't shake the feeling that every second that passed was a second he couldn't get back. It wasn't until he sat down at his desk and started prepping for his presentation that he realized how much his body had changed. He'd gotten used to the subtle aches in his knees and the occasional twinge in his back, but now there was something deeper. His hands, as he turned the pages of his notes, were shaking, not in a way that was nervous, but in a way that was unnatural. Like his joints were already wearing out. He rubbed his temples. What the hell was going on? The presentation went off without a hitch, even though Elliot could barely focus on his slides. His mind was elsewhere, trying to figure out what had happened to him. He kept replaying that moment in the coffee shop, how time had frozen, how he'd played around with the world as if it were his own personal playground. How amazing it had felt. But the price, whatever it was, had to be catching up with him. That much was certain. By the time the workday was over, Elliot felt like he was dragging his body through quicksand. His reflection in the elevator doors looked unfamiliar, his face had softened. Not in a good way. He looked tired. His eyes were too wide, his mouth drawn into a tired frown. He should have been young, full of energy. Instead, he felt like he'd lived 100 years. As he walked out of the building, he saw the flashes of neon signs that normally filled him with a kind of mild excitement. But today? They just looked washed out, blurry. What's happening to me? A sudden realization struck him like a lightning bolt. The aging. The slowdown. The strange pain in his chest. Could it be because of the time manipulation? He'd used it a few times today, freezing the world when he didn't want to face the crowds, speeding up traffic to get to work, even pausing time for a brief moment to pick up his dinner without anyone noticing. But that had all seemed so harmless, so thrilling. He never once considered the cost, but now it felt like he was paying the price. The thought gnawed at him all the way home. He couldn't avoid it any longer. Every time he paused time, his body seemed to lose a piece of itself. If this kept up, he wouldn't be a young man for long. He would be gone. He rushed up the stairs to his apartment, unlocking the door with trembling hands. The instant he stepped inside, he froze. Something was different. A soft, low hum filled the air. It wasn't from the street below, or the fluorescent lights above. This sound was closer, almost intentional. Elliot instinctively checked his watch. The second hand ticked forward, like time was playing catch-up, but it wasn't enough. Something was pressing in on him, something far darker than the ordinary dread of aging. Suddenly, a knock on the door. Elliot's heart slammed against his ribs. He wasn't expecting anyone. He wasn't in the mood to entertain anyone either. Another knock, louder this time. The sound was sharp, insistent. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. He crept cautiously toward the peephole, his breath held. And there they were, two men in suits. One had a stern face, sharp features, and the other looked too polished, too clean to be standing outside a dilapidated apartment like his. Elliot's pulse quickened. They were looking for him. His first instinct was to freeze time, to make them vanish, but his body screamed in protest. The last time he'd done that, the pain had been so intense it was almost unbearable. He wasn't sure how much more his body could take. He backed away from the door and grabbed his phone. He'd have to do this the old-fashioned way. He called his friend Mark, hoping against hope that he would answer. "Elliot? You all right?" Mark's voice sounded groggy, as though he'd been woken up. "I need help," Elliot said, his voice rough. "Someone's at my door. I think they're looking for me." "Looking for you? Who? What's going on, man?" "I don't know, but they're not normal. Can you come over?" Mark paused for a beat, then sighed. "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute. Stay calm. Don't do anything stupid." Elliot could hear him hang up, and as the line went silent, he realized that it was too late for staying calm. The knock came again. This time, it was followed by a deep voice, a voice that seemed to penetrate his very bones. "Elliot Stone. We know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He felt a chill run down his spine. He could freeze time again, he could run, but something told him that these people, whoever they were, knew too much. They had seen him. They had seen his power. And they weren't going to let him slip away so easily. The door burst open, and just like that, the world flipped upside down. The man who entered was tall, with a sharp jawline and dark sunglasses that seemed out of place indoors. His suit was immaculate, as though he had just stepped out of a boardroom meeting, but there was something cold in his eyes, something that didn't belong in the world Elliot had come to know. "You're Elliot Stone?" the man asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. Elliot didn't answer. His mind was racing. What could he do? What should he do? The man glanced at his partner, who stepped inside the apartment, shutting the door behind him. The second man was smaller, but his presence was no less intimidating. "You've been using the ability," the man said, stepping closer. "Time manipulation. The Aeon Consortium has been monitoring you. We know you can stop time. But what we also know is that it's taking a toll on you. Your body is aging. Your time is running out." Elliot felt his blood run cold. Who the hell are you?" "We're the Aeon Consortium. And we've come for your ability." Elliot stood frozen in place, staring at the men who had just entered his apartment. His mind was scrambling, trying to process their words, their presence. He could feel the cold air of their deliberate, controlled power, like something that had been building for years and now, finally, was about to crush him. The taller man, his eyes cold and calculating, took another step forward. The smaller man, who seemed to be the enforcer, remained standing by the door, his eyes scanning the room as if measuring the space for an escape route. It made Elliot feel like a cornered animal, his breath shallow and his heart hammering in his chest. "You're making a mistake," Elliot said, though his voice came out weak, almost desperate. He tried to force the words to sound more confident, but the truth was, his knees felt shaky, and he couldn't stop the cold sweat creeping down his back. "I don't know what you think you know, but I'm not." The taller man raised his hand to silence him. "We don't need to waste time, Elliot. We know what you can do. We know everything. The Aeon Consortium has been monitoring anomalies in the timeline for a long time. You're a rare case. A very rare case. But we've been tracking your disruptions. You thought you could outsmart the clock, but time always catches up." Elliot's heart dropped. The sensation of age weighed heavily on him now, but this felt different. His mind began to race, trying to find an angle, some kind of way out. But everything he tried to think of seemed futile. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't hide. These people had known. "What do you want from me?" Elliot forced out the words. He glanced over at the window, the night now fully fallen, but his apartment felt suffocating. He needed to get out of there, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The man spoke again, his tone now more matter-of-fact, almost clinical. "We don't want to hurt you, Elliot. We just want to take what's ours. Your ability. You've been manipulating time, playing with forces you don't understand. You may think you're still in control, but look at you. You're already losing the fight. You can feel it, can't you? The years slipping away with every second you freeze. Every second you accelerate." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The man was right. He could feel it. His body, once lean and strong, now ached in ways that didn't make sense. The old pain in his joints had become sharper, more constant. His hairline was receding faster. His reflection showed someone older, someone who looked like he'd been alive for far more than his 28 years. "Why?" Elliot asked, his voice hoarse, a hint of panic creeping in. "Why would you want this ability? What are you going to do with it?" The man smiled thinly. "Control. Power. With the ability to stop and start time, we can reshape history. Change anything. Every decision, every moment, can be ours to command. We've been building this for years. And you, Elliot, are going to help us take the next step." The words sank into Elliot's mind like a heavy stone. He could already feel the walls closing in around him. His heart was racing, and his vision was beginning to blur. He'd been so caught up in his own thrill of power that he hadn't stopped to think about the consequences, hadn't considered that someone else might want to harness what he could do. The smaller man by the door took a step toward him. Elliot instinctively took a step back, his body responding before his mind could catch up. He felt trapped. No escape. No time to act, and then, before Elliot could make another move, he felt the sharpest pain yet, a sudden jolt in his chest that nearly knocked him off his feet. It was like someone had just punched him directly in the heart, and for a brief, terrifying second, he thought he might drop dead where he stood. "Stop," the taller man said sharply, and the smaller one hesitated, just for a moment. The pain subsided, but not entirely. It lingered, a dull throb under his ribs. Elliot gasped for air, clutching at his chest. "We don't need you dead yet," the taller man continued, his gaze never leaving Elliot. "But don't think for a second you can fight us. We know what you've done. The toll you've been paying. Your body is decaying, Elliot. And it's only going to get worse. You can't keep running from time." The weight of his words sank in, and Elliot's stomach twisted. He could feel it now, more clearly than ever before. Each time he used his power, time was taking something from him. He wasn't just speeding through moments, he was accelerating his own death. And these men, this consortium, they weren't just after his power, they were after his life. "Please," Elliot gasped, forcing himself to speak even as the pain threatened to overwhelm him. I don't want this. I didn't ask for this. I didn't know. I didn't know it would." "You didn't know?" The man's voice grew colder, more dangerous. "Did you really think you could control time without consequences? That there wouldn't be a price to pay? You've been using something ancient, something we've spent years studying. There's no escape, Elliot. The only thing left for you now is to cooperate. Or we'll take what we need by force." Elliot swallowed hard. His hands were trembling now, his body unsteady. He could feel the weight of the truth closing in on him. He had been playing with something far beyond his understanding. His mind raced, trying to find any possible escape. But the pain in his chest flared again, stronger this time. The air felt thick, and it was getting harder to focus. The world around him seemed to blur. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd felt truly alive, before the pain, before the creeping weight of age. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to freeze time, get away, do anything to break free. But what would it cost him? How much more could he sacrifice before there was nothing left of him at all? And then, just when it felt like his body would give out, when the pain in his chest was unbearable, something inside him snapped. He could feel it in his bones. His hand twitched. His fingers curled into a fist. And before he could fully think, before he even had the chance to rationalize it, he acted. Time stopped. The room froze. The two men who had been advancing on him were now suspended in mid-motion, their faces locked in expressions of cold intent. The hum of the world outside his apartment, the gentle rain on the windowsill, the dull throb of his heartbeat, all of it vanished. Elliot stood, trembling, in the stillness that he gasped for breath, his chest aching, but the pain was still there, a constant reminder of what he had just done. He looked down at his hands, the skin too pale, too worn, the veins crawling underneath like old ropes. Time had given him a moment of respite, but it had cost him. It was always costing him. Every time he paused the world, every time he accelerated it, a piece of him was slipping away, and yet, the temptation was still there. The power. The control. It was so easy to freeze everything around him, to become the master of time itself. But he knew the cost now, he had felt it in his own body, in the years being stolen from him. Elliot knew that he couldn't keep doing this forever. There was no going back. He was already losing himself, piece by piece, every time he used the ability. And the Aeon Consortium wasn't just interested in his power, they wanted to own it. To use it. To manipulate history with it. They would stop at nothing to control him, but as he stood there, frozen in time, Elliot realized something else. The ability to pause time was a gift, yes, but it was also a prison. And he was running out of time to escape. He had no idea how he would do it, how he would stop the consortium, how he would free himself from the grip of time, but for the first time in weeks, a thought formed in his mind: maybe it's time to stop playing. With a deep breath, Elliot took a step forward, ready to make his move. The world around him was still frozen, waiting for him to act. But no matter what came next, Elliot knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same again.